In the late 1930s, the US Navy had sought to guard against a potential future lack of fast fleet oilers at a lower initial expense by striking a deal with the Standard Oil Company. Whereas the default tanker was a 12-knot single-screw vessel, the Navy offered to pay the difference between this and an 18-knot twin-screw variant that would be part of the T3 classification of tankers, with a proviso that in times of war or national emergency the vessels would be taken into naval service. 12 such ships were ordered before the war, the Cimarron class, but as matters turned out, the situation deteriorated so fast that 3 of them, the Cimarron, Neosho and Platte, went straight into the US Navy anyway. The other 9 were built at first for private use, but then would be brought into the Navy over the course of late 1940 and early 1941. But when war broke out, the lessons already learned by the Royal Navy in the Atlantic and the US Navy's own needs dictated a crash course of carrier construction needed to be undertaken. This would include the Independence-class light carriers converted from Cleveland-class light cruisers, and the bulk of the initial major class of escort carrier, the Bogue class, which were converted from C3-type cargo ships after the lessons learned from the 2-ship Long Island-class prototype conversions, which had been built between World War II breaking out in Europe and the US official entry into the conflict. But the demand for escort carriers in the US Navy's program outstripped the available C3-type hulls, and so, in a move that shows just how desperate for flight decks the Allies were at this time, 4 of the precious fast oilers, Sangamon, Suwannee, Shenango, and Santee, were brought into dock to make up the numbers, as they were the only available hull that was somewhat close to the desired speed and displacement. These ships would thus become the Sangamon-class escort carriers. Compared to the Bogues, there were some advantages to this. The Cimarron T3-type hull was a bit larger than the C3 cargo ship hull, resulting in a vessel with almost 60 foot more flight deck length and a larger possible air group. The Bogues generally could take anywhere from a dozen to 2 dozen aircraft, depending on the aircraft type, whilst the Sangamons could start at 2 dozen and go up almost as high as 3 dozen if you mostly or wholly used fighters. Apart from their aircraft, as originally spec'd, the ships would carry 2 single 5-inch 51 caliber anti-surface guns and 4 quad 1.1-inch cannon, as that was pretty much all that was available. However, this would be changed as time went on. Initially, the quad 1.1-inch would be replaced on a mount-for-mount basis by twin 40mm Bofors. Then 20mm Oerlikons were also introduced, and eventually the class was supposed to carry 2 quad and 7 twin 40mm Bofors for 22 in total, as well as up to 20 Oerlikons, and the 5-inch guns were either to be replaced or supplemented by 5-inch 38s when and where it was possible. With a standard displacement of just under 11,500 tons, the ships were capable of 18 knots thanks to 13,500 shaft horsepower supplied from turbines driving 2 screws. As an escort carrier, no meaningful armour would be carried. The one slight downside compared to a C3 cargo ship conversion was that those vessels' engines were amidships and could be trunked to the island, whereas on a tanker the engines are mounted right aft. And so on a Sangamon you won't see a funnel integrated with the small island. Instead, the exhaust is vented either side of the flight deck right aft, which could occasionally cause turbulence issues for aircraft that were on approach. Hauled in for conversion in February and March 1942, they were all back in service as carriers within a month of each other over the span of the end of August 1942 and the bulk of September. All 4 ships were sent pretty much immediately to support Operation Torch, the landings in French North Africa, after which the first 3 were redeployed to the Pacific, with the exception being Santee, which would spend 1943 still in the Atlantic undertaking various missions before eventually joining her sisters in the Pacific campaign, where their heritage as tankers meant they also made for quite handy refuelling ships for their escorting destroyers, as they had substantial leftover bunker capacity. The class overall, and in many cases as a whole, would thus be present for quite a number of important campaigns, with Suwannee and Santee taking kamikaze hits during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Sangamon being hit by a similar attack in May 1945. Shenango would be the only one to escape that particular form of damage, although all the ships bar Suwannee would have serious fires started at one point or another by crashing aircraft from their own air groups. All 4 ships would, however, survive the war, but with so many fleet carriers, light carriers, and newer escort carriers, the class went into mothballs pretty quickly. Sangamon within a couple of months of the Japanese surrender, Shenango and Santee the next year, and Suwannee technically being commissioned until the start of January 1947, although effectively she's also in reserve by the end of 1946. The latter 3 having taken part in Operation Magic Carpet, hence their slightly later retirement dates, whilst Sangamon had still been under repair when the war ended. She would instead be sold for conversion back into a merchant ship, whilst the other 3 vessels would remain in reserve, notionally redesignated as helicopter carriers, until eventually being sold for scrap at the end of the 1950s. Ironically, at almost the same time as the now merchant-configured Sangamon was also being sent to the breakers on the other side of the Pacific.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.